Good afternoon, everybody. This is coincidentally, this is the third time I'm recording this 30-minute long lecture-y thing um, to compensate for having to cancel class today. I've had some technical issues with uh, just any number of things from my computer microphone to just, anyway. So if I have to take a real short half-second break to drink some water every now and again, I hope you pardon that interruption. So this presentation is kind of what I was going to share with you had we had class today. So I'm going to kind of walk through this for about 30 minutes. So the agenda for what this presentation is going to be is we're going to do a little bit of housekeeping in terms of feedback from Saturday's exit slips, what my plan for course evaluations is going to be now that we had a snow day today, sample EdTPA lesson plans and where you can find them, and then presentation groups for Thursday. And we'll do that before I kind of shift into more of a broader lecture around standards and how we teach through them and not to them. All right, so let's start. So the feedback I received from the Saturday exit slips were really good, really interesting as always. There are a lot of questions, specific questions about EdTPA and how you should be thinking about the learning segment and specific lessons, and then what exactly will the EdTPA assessors be assessing for. A lot of those questions, because I probably won't have time to address them on Thursday before our presentations, a lot of those questions I'm going to be using to kind of structure some of the learning activities we're going to do in the student teaching seminar, specifically kind of early on in the seminar, so like early to mid-February, in the hopes to get these questions answered before you actually kind of start in on it. I was also really impressed and kind of heartened by your responses to the things you're excited about. A lot of people spoke to just their excitement to actually be teaching something that they planned. If not from scratch, then pretty close to it, and just how you are kind of looking forward to providing your students with learning opportunity that you think will be really engaging and really motivating to them. So that was really nice to see. There's some other little things here and there that I'll kind of get into kind of later on, either in Thursday or in the student teaching seminar. So I just won't cover those things possibly right now. But if you have any like additional questions that you kind of ask me on these sheets that you want me to kind of push to the top of my to-do list, please feel free to email me and I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. All right, so course evaluations. So I was going to do them at the beginning of class today, but that obviously isn't going to happen. However, you should have received an email from the provost's office with a typical link where you can access them. So please feel free to do that either today or tomorrow or maybe Thursday morning if you have some time. If you don't get to it, that's fine, because I'm going to make some time before we do group presentations on Thursday. The course evaluation for this course this time around are especially important for me because this is kind of the first iteration of the redesign J-term course for secondary folks. And I'm sure that I did some things that didn't quite work as well. And so the feedback you provide me is really going to help me improve it for next year's cohort. I mean, some of the redesign choices I made this year were because of feedback I received from last year's cohort and the cohort before. So this course is kind of a work in progress. And so I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback on the course evaluation so I know how to kind of move forward from here. So really looking forward to that, but that's kind of why I'm going to be pushing it kind of hard and to try to get that response rate up a little bit. So sample EdTPA lessons will be and are available in a folder on the Class Sakai website in the larger resources tab on your left when you go into the Sakai website. So those lesson plans, I think there's a sample lesson plan for all of the disciplines that are represented in the room, with the exception of those of you who are getting endorsed in special education. The reason for that is that I don't really have any sample EdTPA lesson plans on hand for special education because I'm not usually the person who walks them through that process and how to plan or how to write up lesson plans specifically for special education. But I think if you were to take a look at the sample lesson plans that are there, you can get an indication of like the level of detail or just how long the teaching plan is and stuff like that. That said, I want to make sure that y'all don't think that those are like, I'm not posting them because they're exemplary, and I'm not posting them because I think they're a model. I think they're fine. Each one of those lesson plans comes from a portfolio that passed the TPA, so so it means something. But I think there are things about them that can be improved here and there. But they passed, so take that for what it's worth, and just kind of use them as like a big picture way to think about the length. Um, to think of a middle ground between like the length that ITPA is asking you and all the things that I've told you that I think are important to include on a lesson plan. All right, so that's a good starting point to kind of start to wrap your head around what those lesson plans should be. So for the unit presentation groups for Thursday, so I'll kind of show you. I need to kind of move it. I need to find it. Just give me 1 second. I should have pulled this up, but of course my computer did an update. Let's see, is it here? No, it did an update after my last go at this. So as is always the case. Let's see. Oh, there they are. Okay, so these are the groups, the presentation groups that I've kind of put you in for Thursday's presentations. So you'll see that the groups are uneven. So if you are getting endorsed and certificated in art, there are fewer of you than, say, English ELA. So one thing that I've done to ensure that when folks finish, they're not just sitting around just kind of waiting, is I've kind of adjusted the time each group has, depending on the number of folks who are in your group. So if you're in the math, art, and science groups, you'll have 30 minutes max to present your unit and to do a really nice job with that. And then 10 minutes after that 30 minutes will be used for follow-up questions from audience members or for the next person who's going to present to actually load up their presentation. And for those of you who are in the ELA English or Social Studies History group, you'll have 20 minutes max with, of course, the 10 minutes for questions and transitions. I've also kind of dispersed those of you who are getting certificated and endorsed in SPED. I've interspersed you in some of the other content area groups, depending on how I've heard you talk about what your unit plan will be. So, for example, where's Brandon? So, for example, Brandon is in the English ELA group because the unit that he'll be teaching is focused on English ELA skills. So I put him in that group. So I really strongly recommend, I could not recommend this more strongly, that you really put a lot of time and intention into these presentations. Because the better everybody's presentation is, the more ideas will be generated in these presentation groups. And again, I don't need you to do necessarily a rock star job for me, even though I'll be looking at the presentations and you'll be submitting them in your Sakai folder, class website folder. But this is really for you to learn from each other. So I really strongly recommend you kind of put extra amount of time in there so that you're able to help seed the creativity of those who are going to be in the group with you. All right. So those are the group presentations. Let's see what's next. All right. So let's get into kind of the content of the thing now. The teaching through the standards. Stuff that I've kind of been talking about since summer, since the EduUC 510 course that just about most of you were in. So this will be kind of a way to give you, an approach to kind of think about standards. So what I'll do is I'll kind of give you a more global perspective about how standards have worked within schools for the past several years, how they fit within a larger approach to teaching, and then how the academic standards fit in this larger, or fit within this way that we think about what content is in a classroom. So I'm going to kind of be going over those three things. All right, so the pros of content knowledge standards. So standards have been around forever in some shape or form. So Washington State has had, they had what used to be called ELERs, which are essential academic learnings. And I had them when I was an English teacher, a high school English teacher. And I think math folks have them as well, right? So they've been around forever. And before that, I'm sure there was a standards document that I wasn't quite aware of, but I'm sure that was there, right? So the fundamental purpose of standards is to provide grade level guidance on the content that teachers could and should teach, right? So it's pretty straightforward. Um, and and that's actually kind of a good thing, right? I mean, even though I'm all for teacher autonomy and teacher creativity, and stuff like that, it's also important that that we don't have teachers, especially in like perhaps math classes, like teaching vastly different things. It's important that at different times students learn different mathematical concepts, and so that's just providing that grade level guidance is important. The second thing is that guidance kind of historically has highlighted parts of content, parts of what students should learn, that sometimes gets overlooked or ignored in classrooms. And three pretty good examples of that are how, and if you walk into just about any secondary math classroom, you just don't see a whole lot of mathematical conceptual knowledge being taught. And this is no slam on math teachers. This is just the way everybody learned math. Everybody learned to memorize a formula and then to do the formula and then to plug in different numbers into the formula and come up to like the same solution. That's just the way this is just the way this has worked over time. But the problem is that that's not actually the way real mathematicians work. Real mathematicians problem solve based largely off the conceptual knowledge they have of what's happening with the math. So the CCSS tries to make inroads in that area and tries to push teachers to think more conceptually about the math they're teaching and to try to teach students that conceptual knowledge behind the procedures. In the NGSS, there's a whole component around engineering, which is totally new. Engineering for a long time was thought to be kind of part of math, more part of math than science. But there are some really interesting ways that like engineering design processes map on really nicely with the way scientific knowledge is created, through experimentation, through asking a hypothesis and then trying to figure out what the answer to it is. It's that whole kind of iterative process, and it's that process of like a bunch of different people in a bunch of different places are working to kind of answer the same question, and so they find their different small answers to the questions, which then other people replicate, and then when knowledge has been validated, it gets accumulated, right? So it's that iterative kind of stacking knowledge on top of knowledge, that is kind of useful in the engineering design world, right? Like we figure out how to build new, interesting buildings and bridges and just structures, based on trial and error and based on our knowledge of like materials and stuff like that. So a lot of that, that big part or that part of the NGSS is a really important component of those standards documents, because it hasn't been taught historically by teachers, in classrooms. So if you're an ELA English teacher, the text complexity thing is always a good thing to be reminded of. Even though I think that most of the time text complexity is not the biggest issue that's happening in English and ELA classrooms, I think it's really important to remember for one sole reason. And that's that sometimes teachers who teach historically marginalized, and under-resourced communities, particularly students of color, particularly students who qualify for special education services, and particularly students who qualify for English language learner services. Historically, teachers have tended to take more of a deficit approach to those students and think that they can't handle some of the same levels of poetry or fiction or just texts that, say, their white or Asian peers can. So it's a really important reminder to folks who are teaching across contexts that no matter who you're teaching, you still got to pay attention to text complexity, and you still got to make sure you're providing students texts that are reasonably challenging to them. And then the last part of like this whole conversation about why standards are useful is that they do provide some assurance of commonness across classrooms and across schools to help establish some kind of equal opportunity to rigorous academic learning. Again, the existence of implicit bias and systemic racism has been well documented in schools and the educational system. So standards provide kind of one way we could help assure that students who are learning, say, in classrooms in like Flint, Michigan, are learning some of the same things and have been provided opportunities, some of the same rigorous learning opportunities and experiences as, say, students who are growing up in Bel Air, California, right? So to the extent that standards can do that, it's good that standards will do that. But there's also some downsides, right? So a lot of the downsides actually comes from the way schools and districts have the way they've positioned the standards, not necessarily the way the standards have been written, or not necessarily the purpose that the folks who wrote the standards had for them in the first place. So one of those misunderstandings, I think, has been that there are lots of folks out there teaching who think the standards are the curriculum, and that they look at, say, the math CCSS, and they look at, say, all the standards for grade 9 or all the standards for geometry, and they say, we've got to get through all of these over the course of the year. Right, so in essence, the standards then become the curriculum for what the teacher's teaching, and that's not the way those standards were designed. And the folks who've written the standards will tell you that. I think the problem with that is that really starts to crowd out, and I'll get into this with some of the bullet points. It starts to crowd out some of the other things that are important for students to learn beyond the standards. So another thing sometimes the existence of the standards can do, or how they operate in schools, is that they can help create an illusion that all content that students have to learn is equal, and thus should be provided equal weight in the curriculum. That's super problematic, especially when you look at, say, a U.S. history class, right? If all U.S. history is equal, then it makes it really, really challenging for teachers to try to decide and to try to prioritize what their students should learn. And besides, that's just not the way we operate in our day-to-day lives, right? Like, we are constantly prioritizing which things are more important than the other, which things students should learn, right? And so the standards documents don't give us much guidance on that, if any at all, right? So, and the impact of that is that over time, teachers just start to think that everything is important. So they take I just need to go as quickly as possible through this content to teach it all, instead of really worrying about the content that students are actually learning. So that can get really, really problematic. And a lot of that is predicated on this end result of students are going to be taking this SBA, and I don't want my students to fail it. And, so testing weighs heavily in this conversation. So that's not, make as if it doesn't, because it does. But still, right, teachers can sometimes fall into that trap. And then another thing that standards do is that the existence of standards in schools can encourage more emphasis on teaching content and less on teaching softer skills of citizenship. And some of those skills are collaboration, deliberation, with people who are not, collaboration and deliberation with people who are not like us, right, where we have to share differences and come to solutions. They don't emphasize creative problem solving in many cases. I think the NGSS comes kind of close with some of the things that ask students to do. But then there's this whole world of things that we actually teach in school on a day-to-day basis, but they get no airtime, like the teaching of empathy, the teaching of deep understanding of how people live their lives and how that might be different than how we live our lives and what we could learn from other folks. So, the standards have been largely responsible for the extent to which we think that what students should only be learning in school is content. So, that's just not typically the way I try to teach you all how to teach. But it has become something that happens in schools more and more and more. And I think that has had adverse impacts on the students we've taught over the last couple decades. So that's another problem. And then I think even more important than that possibly might be the way that standards have shifted the conversation from the how and why of learning to the what. And this, again, is kind of connected to the whole regime of testing that happens in schools, right? Like we value what we can assess in education. I'm not necessarily saying that's right, but that's how the educational field has done it, right? So because we can't assess, and I really don't want anyone to try to make a test for this, but because we can't assess empathy, right, we don't value it. But we can assess how a student can solve for an equation, right? So we tend to value that a lot more than those other things. And so it tends to tip the balance in favor of the what, instead of really talking to students about the why and how of what they're learning. And And I think like when we think of all the people that we generally consider to be titans of industry, those folks are really, really good at the how and why. And they hire people around them who are good at the what, right? So like, it's always important to ask ourselves like, what kind of people do we want our students to become, and what skills do we really want them to have? And I think if we're honest with ourselves, content really is only just one part of that equation. All right, so now the content standards also fit within just this larger, I don't know why. Well, let me try it this way. Hold on a second. Because I want y'all to see like that animation, because I spent a whole 30 seconds on it. No, that's not what I want either. Let's see. Sorry. Okay. Play from current slide. There we go. Okay, so, and this is actually a little bit better. All right, so this all connects to this larger idea about the building blocks of good teaching. And this is kind of review for what we've kind of been talking about in the program since summer. I'm pretty sure I went over this with all of you in the 510 class, but if not, here it is. And even if I did, this is a good kind of reminder at this point in the program. So overarching everything we do in the classroom is a sense of pedagogy. And what I mean by pedagogy is what our philosophical approach to teaching is. This includes everything from what we see our role is in schools, in classrooms, as teachers in broader society, to what we think the capacity of our students is, and like what we think they could do in the classroom, and how we can bring who they are into the classroom to inform how we do our work. Right, so some of what we call pedagogies might be things like problem and project-based learning. It might be this very large or big umbrella idea of constructivist learning, where students kind of co-create their learning with a teacher or just with each other, right? So that's kind of, pedagogy is those big value statements that we use when we talk about who we are as teachers and what we want to accomplish in the lives of students. Methodology is kind of one step down, and methodology is how we use our pedagogy to deliver essential content. So that could be lecture, it could be discussion, it could be small group work, small group discussions, right? And so in theory, there will be a really strong connection between our pedagogy and the methods we use in order to deliver instruction. The next step down are strategies. And those are kind of the everyday teacher moves that support both our pedagogy and our methodology. And these are like those small bits, like it's a follow-up questions we ask. It's how we do the do nows. It's how we do the exit slips. It's how we check for understanding. It's things like wait time. It's seating charts. It's all of those different things, right? And the reason why pedagogy is really important is that pedagogy gives us a framework to use to make decisions about what methodologies and what strategies we're going to use in the classroom. So if we are unclear about our pedagogy, we're just going to keep tacking all over the place to choose just any number of different strategies that won't create a sense of cohesion or intention with our students in our classroom, right? So really, really great classrooms, you'll see a really strong alignment between these three things. So the question is, where do the standards come in? Well, I think the content standards lie somewhere in that ground between and within methodology and strategies, right? So content standards shouldn't be our very first thing that we think about when we think about teaching, right? They shouldn't be our pedagogy, right? Our pedagogy should inform the ways in which we situate content standards in our classroom and the ways in which we use smart and strategic methodology and strategies in order to make sure students learn the content that we want them to learn, right? So it's really important. I wanted you to see this because it's really important that we situate content standards properly and how we look at what our teaching practice is, and that we don't give content standards more space than they should occupy in the grander scheme of what it means to be a good teacher. So, and this is just another way to kind of think about it, right? So when we look at content just specifically as a thing that happens in our classroom, and we zero in on that, and we don't talk necessarily about how students are central in the classrooms, in our classroom or anything like that. If we just look at content, here's one way that we could actually look at content and what it is, right? And then ways we can think about where standards fit within the content that we teach. So I'm going to propose through this kind of diagram that content is a little bit broader than what most, I think, teachers think it is. So to me, content is the academic, social, emotional skills, knowledge, and dispositions. So usually, if you walk into everyday classrooms, normal classrooms, like typical classrooms, content, teachers will tell you that content are the academic skills and academic knowledge that students need to learn. That's fine. That's great. It's a great starting point. But I would urge you to think that as teachers, especially with all the needs students come to us with mental health and any number of issues, trauma and all of that, that content has to be so much larger than just the academic skills and knowledge. Content has to envelop the social emotional skills and knowledge and the dispositions we want students to walk away from our classrooms with. And by dispositions, I mean things like the ways in which they use different problem solving skills to persevere when they get stuck on specific parts of content, the way they are empathetic with peers, the way they act in small group work, the way they collaborate, the way they cooperate, the way they're polite to other students, the way they encourage them, the way they hold each other accountable to different rules, different norms in the classroom, right? So all of these different parts of content make the classroom work, right? So when we're thinking about the role that content standards plays in the classroom, I think it's like that smaller blue bubble kind of down there to the left under skills, right? So it's still part of a constellation of things that make up content, but it's not central to, right? And so this is, you may agree with me, you may disagree with me, you may think, no, Paul, definitely standards are that really big blue bubble where it says content. That's fine. You can, if that's a way that it's easiest for you to kind of think about it, I think that's fine. I would just urge you to think that, to not give standards that much perhaps space in your classroom and to look at content as a far more holistic idea, of which content standards are a smaller piece, right? So they're still within the orbit, they're still within the constellation of what we consider content, but they're not necessarily central. Right, so when we think about how do we teach through the standards, not to the standards, here's one way that you can think about it. And this is kind of an overview from the EduC 510 class. So when we think about teaching through, not to the standards, so there are three kind of different things that I think overall our units should have in them, or should be set up so that when we look at, if we were to kind of situate our units on some kind of a diagram like this is the way it should fall out, right? So we have the focal required content that we teach. That content will be in conversation with some standard or standards, CCSS English, CCSS Math, not CCSS, the NGSS, right? So the focal and required content should speak to the standards and in some ways might reflect the standards. But it's a real mistake if we as teachers think that our job then is just to teach to the standard and then that's it. And then we assess the standard and that assessment is somewhat decontextualized from everything else the student is experiencing out in the world. So really good high-level learning is when we move through the standards, right? We acknowledge they're there, we acknowledge their role in our instruction, but in some sense, we're just kind of hand-waving to them as we drive on through to this far more interesting place in our instruction, which is asking students to apply what they've learned about the content in ways that are relevant to them, relevant to their lives, relevant to who they are as people, and in ways that are authentic to what they see like professionals doing with the content out in the world. Right? So that's why assessment is so kind of crucial to what happens in a classroom, is that it gives us that opportunity to draw connections between where students see the content in the real world and then asking them to apply it in those similar ways, right? So if we just teach to the standards, we miss that whole piece of authentic and relevant application of content, right? But if we're willing to go through the standards to that application of content, we're going to get students who are far more engaged in their learning, and they will accomplish and over time master far more standards than they would have otherwise if we're just teaching to them. Because if we're just teaching to them, the students will just go through and do it in a very compliant, halfway resistant way, and they'll learn the content connected to the standards because they feel like they have to. But it's our job as teachers to create assessment or create opportunities for them to demonstrate their learning in really authentic, really relevant ways to them. And in so doing, right, demonstrate to us that they have mastered the standards, right? So it's our job to move all the way through to that application of content. So that's what I mean when I talk about teaching through and not to the standards. So what do I want you to do in this unit? And what are some of the things that I'd like you to think about as you start to complete and flesh out this unit? And how should you work with standards when you're thinking about unit design? So yes, identify and apply the relevant and specific standards, but do so only after you've done these three things. Do so only after you're clear about the specific content that you want and need to teach, right? And content should include, again, the skills, the knowledge, the dispositions that you want students to have as a result of this unit. The second thing, apply the standards after you have a working idea of how you'll make the learning relevant to students, their lives, who they are, and authentic to something that professionals do out in the world, right? So that is your hook. That is the thing that is your time to bend the curriculum to the students you have in front of you. That's your time to wrap the content around who the students are, right? But we do that before we head to the standards, all right? So we pay attention to the student. We put the student in the center before we start thinking about all the specific standards that we're going to try to meet. And the third thing, you'll have to have an idea for how you'll be assessing student learning of the content. And it should give students lots of choice about how they demonstrate learning to you. It should give them flexibility so that they can demonstrate learning to you in a number of different ways. It should be somewhat authentic. It should be somewhat relevant to them. So after you have those three things, right, identification of specific content, how you're going to make it relevant to students, and then how you're going to assess it, then you go back and you say, all right, what standards am I meeting through this wonderfully engaging unit that I'm teaching? And I bet that what you'll find is that you'll have more standards to choose from than less, and that your problem won't be to identify the standards your students are meeting. It'll be to choose the specific ones out of a whole suite, out of a whole array of standards that your students will be meeting, to choose the specific ones that you want to focus on for that particular unit. And that's the goal, right? We forefront the creative unit and lesson planning process that's centered on the student, centered on their interests, centered on what they find relevant, centered on the authenticity of the content they're learning to the real world, right? We do all of that first, right, before we start talking really specifically about standard X, standard Y, standard Z, right? Because students won't buy into standards, but they're going to buy into the extent to which what you're designing is relevant to them, right? So that's where we start to make sure they can meet the standard and make sure that that gives us a better sense of what they're learning in regards to the standards. Okay, so what should you be thinking about before Thursday, and what should you be kind of preparing to get done for Thursday? So the first thing you'll need to get done is to finish your group presentation. And that group presentation will include all the parts of your assignment for this course that's due on Sunday by midnight. And if you're thinking about your assignment, your big assignment, here's a way to kind of think about it. So I would give the EdTPA learning segment, if I've got a 20-minute presentation, I would give it maybe 5 minutes, right? And if I'm doing the 30-minute one, maybe I would give it like 7 to 10. No more than that, because what people are really going to want to hear is not necessarily what you're doing with your EdTPA learning segment, although that will be interesting, but what they're really, really going to want to hear is a way that you're framing learning in ways that are relevant and authentic to students. So spend most of your time talking about the narrative introduction to your unit, what that looks like, how you're going to hook students, then your scope and sequence, which is illustrated on your unit calendar. When are students going to be learning what and for what reasons? And then your assessment, the ways in which you're going to be assessing students, right? And asking them to apply what they've learned to some part of the world out there so that they can see that they can actually use the content you've taught them in order to make a difference in some small, some meaningful ways out in the world, right? So that's kind of one of the ways that I want you to kind of be thinking about what that group presentation is. And then have a strong working draft of the big parts of the assignment for Thursday, right? And the first bullet point, the presentation, and the working draft kind of go hand in hand. right? So by the time Thursday rolls around and class time on Thursday rolls around, you'll probably have a really good sense of these two things. Right, and then start planning. The last thing you should do is start planning your EdTPA learning segment in Greater T-Dale. And I would even suggest that if you have to short on one area as you're planning the presentation, then maybe you use a detailed planning of the EdTPA learning segment until Friday or Saturday. If you're looking to do some of this work over the weekend, that's the work I would leave till the weekend. Again, don't get super, super detailed with the EdTPA learning segment because things will probably shift once you're in your classroom and once you start to teach. So you want to give yourself enough of a guidance so you know what you're doing and you've got a pretty good idea of what you're doing, but you don't want to get so specific and spend so much time on getting specific that you're heartbroken when you have to change things because something happens in your school, in your classroom, what have you. All right. So these are the things I'd like you to do for Thursday and ways to think about how you can get ready for Thursday. If the weather does another 90-degree turn for the worse before Thursday, I will again be in touch with everybody about what Thursday will look like and how I'm going to handle it in case class needs to be canceled. I already have some ideas because I've been thinking about this already, but hopefully it won't come to that. If you have any questions between now and Thursday, you all know how to reach me. And keep an eye on the Classici website for all of those materials, the group presentation document, right, the sample lesson plans, this presentation, and also the PowerPoint presentation from Saturday to kind of anchor your stuff. And I will try to answer your emails as they come in or within 24 hours. So there you go. So hopefully, some of you will get to experience the glory that is waking up in the morning and finding out the school is canceled, which means that you have a pretty nice empty day for yourselves tomorrow, unless you're a parent, and then it's just the opposite. But I hope that you get some time to get some work done tomorrow and tonight. Maybe you treat yourself to a nice bottle of wine or something, or a delicious beer, and have that as you're working your way through the planning process. And I hope to see you all on Thursday and to close out the course then. And hope you all are safe and warm and cozy in your homes or wherever you live. So I'll see everybody Thursday. Looking forward to it, and I hope you have a good night.